The Book of Deuteronomy occupies a pivotal place in Scripture. It primarily records the final speeches of Moses. These were delivered to the children of Israel. They stood on the very edge of the Promised Land. This was a moment of great anticipation. It was also a moment for solemn reflection. Moses knew his time on earth was ending. He had led God's people for 40 long years. Now, he sought to prepare them for their future, a future he himself would not physically enter. These addresses are more than just farewells. They are a powerful restatement of God's law. They serve as an urgent call to covenant faithfulness. The generation listening was largely new. Their parents had perished in the wilderness. This was due to their unbelief and rebellion. This new generation needed to hear God's words. They needed to understand their sacred obligations. Moses spoke with the heart of a shepherd. He longed for Israel to choose life and blessing. The setting itself speaks volumes about the book's message. Israel was camped on the plains of Moab. Across the Jordan River lay Canaan. This was the land God had promised to Abraham. It was promised to Isaac and to Jacob. The long journey from Egypt was almost over, yet the greatest challenges were perhaps still ahead. Conquering the land would require faith and courage. Living in the land would require obedience. Deuteronomy was given to equip them for both tasks. Therefore, Deuteronomy is a book of transition. It bridges the wilderness wanderings and the settlement in Canaan. It looks back at God's mighty acts of deliverance. It also looks forward to life under God's rule. The name Deuteronomy means second law or repeated law. This does not imply a new law was given. Rather, Moses expounded the existing Mosaic law. He applied it afresh to this new generation. His words were meant to enter their hearts deeply. They were to shape their lives in the land. At the very heart of Deuteronomy lies the covenant. This sacred agreement bound Israel to God, and it bound God to Israel in a special way. God had chosen Israel out of his sovereign love. He rescued them from slavery in Egypt. He sustained them in the barren wilderness. He gave them his good laws at Mount Sinai. These acts demonstrated his faithfulness and grace. Israel's part was to respond with loyalty. They were to live according to his commands. The call to obedience in Deuteronomy is paramount. However, this obedience was not to be merely external. It was not just about following rules mechanically. God desired obedience that flowed from the heart, a heart transformed by his love and goodness. This is why Moses emphasized the inner disposition. He called the people to circumcise their hearts. This meant removing stubbornness and rebellion. It meant cultivating a spirit of willing submission. True obedience is a reflection of inner devotion. This emphasis finds its clearest expression in a key verse. Deuteronomy 6:5 declares a profound truth, "And thou shalt love the Lord thy God." This love was to be all-encompassing, with all thine heart, and with all thy soul, and with all thy might, it continues. This command to love God totally is foundational. It precedes the specific laws and statutes, because love is the true wellspring of obedience. When love for God fills the heart, service follows. Therefore the laws detailed in Deuteronomy are framed by love. They are not arbitrary demands from a distant ruler. Instead, they are guidelines for a loving relationship. They teach Israel how to live as God's holy people. They show how to maintain fellowship with him, and they instruct how to live rightly with one another. Obedience was the pathway to blessing and life. Disobedience, conversely, would lead to curses and sorrow. Moses presented this choice with stark clarity. The people were to choose whom they would serve. The message of Deuteronomy is not confined to ancient Israel. Its powerful themes resonate through the ages. They speak directly to believers in every generation. The call to wholehearted devotion to God is timeless. The emphasis on loving God above all else remains central. This is true for those under the New Covenant too. Jesus himself affirmed the Great Commandment. He quoted Deuteronomy 6:5 directly. This underscores its abiding importance for Christians. Our love for God should also be all-consuming. Furthermore, Deuteronomy reminds us of God's faithfulness. Just as God was faithful to Israel, he is faithful to us. He has shown his ultimate love through Jesus Christ. He has rescued us from the slavery of sin. He guides us through the wilderness of this world. He promises us an eternal inheritance. Our response, like Israel's, should be grateful obedience. This obedience flows from a heart touched by his grace. It is a joyful expression of our love for him, not a means of earning salvation, but its fruit. The principles of covenant relationship also apply. While the specific form of the covenant has changed, the concept of being God's chosen people continues. Believers are part of the new covenant in Christ. We are called to live as a holy nation. We are a royal priesthood, set apart for God. Deuteronomy's warnings against idolatry are still relevant. We must guard against anything that usurps God's place, anything that takes first place in our hearts. Our allegiance must be to Him alone. Thus, Deuteronomy stands as a powerful call. It calls us to remember God's past actions. It calls us to heed His present commands. And it calls us to embrace His future promises. It urges a commitment that is not half-hearted, but one that engages our entire being. As we study this ancient book, we find fresh encouragement. We find conviction for our own spiritual walk. May we, like Israel of old, choose life. May we choose to love and serve the Lord faithfully. Moses began his first great address to the children of Israel. They were gathered on the east side of the Jordan River. This was in the land of Moab, a significant location. He spoke the words God commanded him to deliver. This new generation stood at a critical juncture. They were poised to enter the land promised to their fathers. Moses reminded them of the events that led them here. His purpose was to stir their hearts to faithfulness. He wanted them to remember God's past dealings. This remembrance was crucial for their future success. He took them back in time to Mount Horeb, also known as Sinai. It was there that the Lord their God had spoken. God had declared that their time at Horeb was over. Ye have dwelt long enough in this mount, God had said. He commanded them to turn and begin their journey. They were to go towards the hill country of the Amorites, and to all the neighboring places in the Arabah. The objective was clear: to possess the land God swore to give Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God's faithfulness to His patriarchal promises was foundational. Moses then recounted a practical step taken at God's prompting. As the people prepared to move, their numbers were great. Moses acknowledged he could not bear the burden alone. He reminded them how he had spoken about this challenge. The Lord had multiplied them like the stars of heaven. This was a partial fulfillment of God's promise to Abraham. Moses blessed them, praying for further increase. He prayed God would bless them as He had promised. This acknowledgement of growth was a testament to God's blessing, yet it also presented an administrative necessity for order. To address the burden of leadership, a system was established. Moses instructed the people to choose wise men. These men were to be understanding and respected. They would be appointed as leaders over the tribes. There would be leaders of thousands, hundreds, fifties, and tens. These appointed officials would judge the people righteously. They were charged to judge fairly between Israelites, and also between an Israelite and a stranger among them. This structure was God's provision for justice and good governance. It showed God's concern for their societal well-being. Section 2. Through the Great and Terrible Wilderness, Divine Guidance and Provision. Moses continued his historical review, focusing on the wilderness journey. He reminded them of their departure from Horeb. They traveled through the great and terrible wilderness. This was the path God commanded them to take. They journeyed towards the hill country of the Amorites. Eventually they arrived at Kadesh Barnea, a critical point. This location marked the southern edge of the Promised Land. The journey itself was a test of faith and endurance. God's presence, however, was their constant guide. He led them by a pillar of cloud and fire. Moses then recounted God's specific instructions concerning other nations. As Israel journeyed, they were not to provoke Edom. The descendants of Esau lived in Seir. God had given Mount Seir to Esau as a possession. Israel was to pass through their territory peacefully. They were to purchase food and water from the Edomites. Similarly, God commanded them not to harass Moab or Ammon. These were descendants of Lot, Abraham's nephew. God had given Ar to the Moabites and land to the Ammonites. This showed God's sovereign control over all nations and lands. During the long 40 years of wilderness wanderings, God provided. Moses emphasized that the Lord their God had been with them. He declared, "Thou hast lacked nothing." Their clothes did not wear out upon them. Their feet did not swell during those many years. This miraculous provision was a constant sign. It was a sign of God's sustaining faithfulness. Even when Israel was disobedient and wayward, God did not abandon His people in the harsh desert. His daily care was a testament to His patient love. After the generation that refused to enter Canaan perished, God acted. The new generation witnessed God's power anew. God commanded them to rise up and cross the Zered Valley. Then, He instructed them to cross the Arnon River. This marked the beginning of their conquest of Transjordan. God declared He had given Sihon the Amorite, king of Heshbon, into their hand. Israel was to engage him in battle and take his land. God promised to put the dread and fear of Israel on surrounding nations. This recent experience of victory was fresh in their minds. It was a powerful, contemporary reminder of God's mighty faithfulness. Section 3. Victories and Vestiges, God's Power and Moses' Personal Plea. Moses proceeded to recount the significant victories God granted Israel. He detailed the conquest of Sihon, king of Heshbon. God had hardened Sihon's spirit and made his heart obstinate. This was so that God could deliver him into Israel's hand. The Israelites utterly destroyed his cities, men, women, and children. They left no survivors except for the livestock as plunder. This victory was a clear demonstration of God's power. It showed God fighting for his people as he promised. From Aroer on the Arnon Gorge to Gilead, no town was too strong. The Lord their God gave all to them. Following the defeat of Sihon, Israel faced Og, king of Bashan. Og came out against them with his entire army for battle at Edrei. But the Lord reassured Moses, "Do not fear him." God promised to deliver Og and all his people and his land. Israel was to do to Og as they had done to Sihon. So, the Lord their God also delivered Og into their hands. They struck him down until no survivor was left. They captured all 60 of his cities in the region of Argob. These fortified cities with high walls, gates, and bars fell to Israel. This further solidified their understanding of God's invincible power. After these conquests, the land east of the Jordan was distributed. Moses reminded them how he gave this territory to certain tribes. The Reubenites and Gadites received the land from Aroer. This included half the hill country of Gilead and its towns. The rest of Gilead and all of Bashan, Og's kingdom, he gave. It was given to the half-tribe of Manasseh. This distribution was a tangible sign of God fulfilling his word. The promise of land was beginning to materialize before their eyes. These tribes had requested this land for their livestock. Moses granted their request with specific conditions of military service. Amidst these recollections of triumph, Moses shared a personal sorrow. He recounted how he pleaded with the Lord at that time. He earnestly begged God to allow him to cross the Jordan. He longed to see the good land beyond the river. That beautiful hill country and Lebanon were his desire. But the Lord was angry with him on account of the people. God would not listen to Moses' plea. The Lord told him, "Enough from you. Do not speak to me of this matter again." Moses was permitted only to see the land from Mount Pisgah. This human element shows God's unswerving justice, yet Moses' continued faithfulness in leadership. Section 4. The Heart of Obedience. Remembering God's uniqueness and seeking him. Moses then shifted his focus to earnest exhortation. He urged the people to listen carefully to the statutes and rules. These were the commands he was teaching them to follow. Obedience was presented as the key to life. By keeping God's commands, they would live. They would also go in and take possession of the land that the Lord, the God of their ancestors, was giving them. He strictly warned them not to add to God's word, nor were they to subtract from it. They were to keep the commands of the Lord their God fully. A crucial part of Moses' address was emphasizing God's uniqueness. He reminded them of what the Lord did because of Baal Peor. The Lord their God destroyed everyone who followed Baal of Peor. But those who held fast to the Lord their God were alive. He stressed that no other nation had a God so near, no other deity answered them whenever they called upon him, and what other nation was so great as to have such righteous decrees, righteous laws like the ones Moses set before them that day. Their God was unseen, unlike the idols of the nations. He spoke to them from the midst of fire at Horeb. Moses passionately warned against the peril of forgetting God. He urged them to be careful and watch themselves closely. They must not forget the things their eyes had seen. These memories of God's acts must not leave their hearts, not as long as they lived. They were to teach these things to their children, and also to their children's children for generations. The danger was that prosperity in the land might lead to complacency. It might lead to corruption and the making of idols. This would provoke the Lord to anger and bring disaster. Despite the stern warnings of judgment and exile for disobedience, Moses concluded this section of his address with a message of hope. This hope was rooted in God's profound mercy and faithfulness. He declared, "But if from thence thou shalt seek the Lord thy God," this seeking was to be done with all their heart, and with all their soul, even from a place of distress, if they turned back to him and obeyed his voice. The Lord their God, being a merciful God, would not abandon them. He would not destroy them or forget the covenant. The covenant he had sworn to their ancestors, he would uphold. The foundation of covenant, the 10 words from Horeb. Moses continued to address the assembly of Israel. He called every person to listen with utmost attention. "Hear, O Israel, the statutes and judgments which I speak in your ears this day," he declared. The purpose was clear, that they might learn them, and crucially, that they might keep and do them. Moses then reminded them of the profound covenant God made. This covenant was established at Horeb, Mount Sinai. He emphasized its direct relevance to the current generation. The Lord did not make this covenant with their fathers only, but with them, all who were alive there that day. The Lord spoke with them face to face at the mountain. He communicated directly from the midst of the consuming fire. Moses stood between the Lord and the people at that time. His role was to declare to them the word of the Lord. For the people were afraid because of the awesome fire. They did not go up into the mountain themselves. Then Moses solemnly recounted the 10 Commandments. These 10 words formed the ethical bedrock of the covenant. They began with God's declaration of his identity and his saving act. "I am the Lord thy God, which brought thee out of the land of Egypt, from the house of bondage." The commandments covered duties towards God and towards fellow human beings. Prohibitions against idolatry and taking God's name in vain were paramount. The observance of the Sabbath day was a sign of the covenant. Honoring parents was linked to longevity in the promised land. The prohibitions against murder, adultery, stealing, and false witness were fundamental. The final commandment against coveting addressed the inner desires of the heart. These laws were not arbitrary, they reflected God's holy character. They were designed for Israel's good and societal harmony. After the direct revelation of these commandments, the people were overwhelmed. The sight of the fire, the darkness, cloud, and the loud voice instilled deep fear. The people, through their elders and tribal heads, approached Moses. They acknowledged the awesome power and glory of God. They confessed that God had spoken to man and man still lived. However, they expressed their mortal fear of the consuming fire. "If we hear the voice of the Lord our God any more, then we shall die," they reasoned. They requested that Moses act as their intermediary. He should go near and hear all that the Lord would say. Then Moses could relay God's words to them, and they would obey. The Lord heard their words and approved of their respectful fear. God wished that such a heart would be in them always, to fear him and keep his commands. The heart of the law: love, loyalty, and remembrance. Having re-established the foundational 10 Commandments, Moses moved to the core principle. He presented what would become the central confession of Israelite faith. "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one Lord," he proclaimed. This declaration, known as the Shema, emphasized God's unique oneness. It stood in stark contrast to the polytheistic beliefs of surrounding nations. Flowing directly from this understanding of God's nature came the primary command: "And thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thine heart, and with all thy soul, and with all thy might," it continued. This was not a call for mere outward compliance. It was a demand for total, all-encompassing devotion and affection. These words, which Moses commanded them that day, were to be in their hearts. They were not to be forgotten or treated lightly. Instead, they were to be diligently taught to their children. This instruction was to be a constant feature of family life. They were to speak of them when sitting in their houses, and when walking by the way, when lying down, and when rising up. The law of God was to permeate every aspect of their existence. It was to be bound as a sign on their hands, and as frontlets between their eyes and written on their doorposts. This ensured constant remembrance and engagement with God's truth. Moses then issued a solemn warning against the perils of prosperity. He knew that once settled in the good land, they might forget God. When they had eaten and were full, living in goodly houses, when their herds and flocks, silver and gold, had multiplied, there was a great danger that their hearts would become lifted up. They might forget the Lord their God who brought them from Egypt, the God who led them through the great and terrible wilderness, a land of fiery serpents, scorpions, and drought, the God who brought forth water from the flinty rock for them, and who fed them in the wilderness with manna unknown to their fathers. This provision in the wilderness was to humble them and test them. Ultimately, it was to do them good in the end. Therefore they must never say in their hearts, "My power and the might of mine hand hath gotten me this wealth." Instead, they were to remember the Lord their God, for it is he who gives power to get wealth. This was so he could establish his covenant sworn to their fathers. Forgetting God would lead to perishing, just like the nations God was driving out. The land itself was a gift, a testament to God's grace. Their success would not be due to their own strength or righteousness alone. Constant remembrance of God's past faithfulness was key to future obedience and blessing. Chosen for covenant separation, sanctity, and divine grace, Moses continued to instruct Israel on their conduct in the Promised Land. A critical aspect involved their interaction with the Canaanite nations. The Lord their God would deliver these nations before them. Israel was commanded to make no covenant with them, nor were they to show mercy to them in terms of allowing their idolatrous practices. They were not to intermarry with them, for a clear reason. Such unions would turn their children away from following the Lord. They would lead them to serve other gods, provoking God's anger. Instead, Israel was to destroy their altars and break their pillars. They were to cut down their Asherah poles and burn their idols, ensuring complete separation. The reason for this radical separation was Israel's unique status. "For thou art an holy people unto the Lord thy God," Moses declared. The Lord their God had chosen them to be a special treasure. They were chosen above all people that are upon the face of the earth. This election was not based on Israel's greatness or numbers. In fact, Moses reminded them they were the fewest of all peoples. But it was because the Lord loved them, and because he would keep the oath which he had sworn unto their fathers. God's sovereign love and covenant faithfulness were the basis of their chosenness. This status as a holy, treasured possession demanded a life of sanctity. Moses then forcefully reminded them of their own past failures. He did this to dispel any notion of self-righteousness. "Understand therefore that the Lord thy God giveth thee not this good land to possess it for thy righteousness," he stated. He plainly told them, "For thou art a stiff-necked people." He recounted their persistent rebellion from the day they left Egypt. They provoked the Lord to wrath in the wilderness. The most glaring example was the incident of the golden calf at Horeb. While Moses was on the mountain receiving the law, they quickly turned aside. They made a molten image and worshipped it, corrupting themselves. God's anger was so intense he considered destroying them completely. It was only through Moses' earnest intercession that they were spared. He reminded God of his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He pleaded for God not to look upon their stubbornness or wickedness. Moses fasted 40 days and nights praying for the people. This stark reminder of their sinfulness served a vital purpose. It highlighted that their inheritance of the land was not earned. It was a gift of God's grace and his faithfulness to his promises. It was also due to the wickedness of the Canaanite nations. God was using Israel as an instrument of his judgment, but Israel itself was equally dependent on God's mercy and forgiveness. Section 4. The essence of true worship: fear, walk, love, serve, keep. After reminding Israel of their past sins and God's mercy, Moses spoke of renewal. The Lord commanded Moses to hew 2 tablets of stone like the first. The first set had been broken by Moses in anger at their sin. God promised to write on these new tablets the words that were on the first. This act symbolized the renewal of the covenant despite Israel's failure. Moses was also to make an ark of wood to house these tablets. This Ark of the Covenant would be a central symbol of God's presence. It would remind them of his law and his covenant relationship with them. The Levites were set apart to carry the Ark, to minister to God. They were to bless in his name, showing God's order and provision for worship. Moses then posed a profound and summary question to the people. "And now, Israel, what doth the Lord thy God require of thee?" The answer encapsulated the entire duty of God's covenant people. It was to fear the Lord thy God. This fear was not a cowering terror but a reverential awe. It also required them to walk in all his ways. This meant a life lived in accordance with his revealed will. Furthermore, they were to love him, and to serve the Lord thy God. This service was to be with all their heart and with all their soul. Finally, they were to keep the commandments of the Lord and his statutes. This devotion was to be internal, not merely external. Moses called them to circumcise, therefore, the foreskin of your heart. They were to be no more stiff-necked or rebellious. True obedience flows from a changed heart, one that is tender towards God. He reminded them of God's supreme greatness and power. "For the Lord your God is God of gods and Lord of lords. He is a great God, a mighty and a terrible, which regardeth not persons, nor taketh reward. This great God also executes justice for the fatherless and widow, and he loves the stranger, giving him food and raiment." Israel, therefore, was also to love the stranger, remembering their own past. Moses concluded this section of his discourse with a powerful appeal. He set before them the clear consequences of their choices. He reiterated the importance of loving the Lord their God. They were to keep his charge, his statutes, his judgments, and his commandments always. He reminded them of God's mighty acts which their eyes had seen, the plagues in Egypt, the parting of the Red Sea, the wilderness provision, and the judgment on Dathan and Abiram. Obedience would lead to strength, possession of the land, and long life. It would lead to a land flowing with milk and honey, blessed by God's continual care. Disobedience, however, would bring curses, and ultimately removal from the land. Section 1. Mounts of Decision, the Law Inscribed and Curses Proclaimed. Moses continued to prepare Israel for their entry into Canaan. He detailed a significant ceremony to be performed. This was to take place once they crossed the Jordan River. On that day they were to set up large stones. These stones were to be coated with plaster. Upon them, they were to write all the words of this law. This public display would serve as a permanent reminder. It would remind them of God's commands in the new land. The law was to be their guide and foundation, a visible testimony to their covenant obligations. Furthermore, they were to build an altar on Mount Ebal. This altar was to be made of uncut stones. No iron tool was to be used upon them. On this altar, they were to offer burnt offerings to the Lord. They were also to sacrifice peace offerings. They would eat there and rejoice before the Lord their God. Mount Ebal, designated for the curses, would ironically host this act of worship. This paradox highlighted that even in judgment, access to God through sacrifice remained. The writing of the law was to be done very plainly, so that all could read and understand its precepts clearly. The tribes of Israel were then to be divided. 6 tribes were to stand on Mount Gerizim to bless the people. These were Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Joseph, and Benjamin. The other 6 tribes were to stand on Mount Ebal to pronounce curses. These were Reuben, Gad, Asher, Zebulun, Dan, and Naphtali. Mount Gerizim, a fertile and verdant mountain, symbolized blessing. Mount Ebal, barren and rocky, fittingly represented the curses. This dramatic visual and auditory presentation would impress upon them the gravity of their choices. Their future in the land depended on their response to God's law. The blessings and curses were not abstract concepts but tangible realities. The Levites were to play a crucial role in this ceremony. They would proclaim with a loud voice specific curses. These curses targeted hidden sins and overt transgressions. Cursed was the man who made a carved or molten image. Cursed was he who treated his father or mother with contempt. Cursed was he who moved his neighbor's landmark. Cursed was he who misled the blind or perverted justice. Other curses addressed sins like incest, bestiality, and secret violence. To each curse all the people were to respond, Amen. This solemn affirmation signified their agreement with God's righteous judgments. Section 2. Pathways of Providence, the Rich Rewards of Covenant Loyalty. Moses then transitioned to detailing the blessings for obedience. He presented a vivid picture of national and personal prosperity. This prosperity was entirely conditional upon their faithfulness, and it shall come to pass if thou shalt hearken diligently unto the voice of the Lord thy God, he began. They were to observe and to do all his commandments. If they did so, the Lord would set them high above all nations. All these blessings would come upon them and overtake them. This was the glorious prospect offered to a faithful Israel. God desired to bless his people abundantly. Their obedience was the key to unlocking this divine favor. The blessings would permeate every area of their lives. Blessed shalt thou be in the city, and blessed shalt thou be in the field, Moses declared. The fruit of their body, their children, would be blessed. The produce of their ground and the increase of their livestock would flourish. Their basket and their store, representing their food supply, would be blessed. They would experience blessing when they came in and when they went out. This comprehensive blessing covered their homes, their work, and their movements. God's favor would be evident in all their endeavors. It promised security, sufficiency, and success. A life lived under God's smile was a life of true abundance. Furthermore, God promised them victory over their enemies. The Lord would cause their enemies who rose against them to be defeated. These enemies would come out against them one way, but they would flee before them 7 ways. The Lord would command the blessing upon their storehouses, and in all that they set their hand to do, he would bless them in the land he was giving them. This divine protection and provision would establish them securely. It would make them a testament to God's power and goodness. Other nations would see God's hand upon Israel. This state of blessing would elevate Israel to a special status. The Lord would establish them as a holy people to himself. This was in accordance with the oath he had sworn to them. This would happen if they kept his commandments and walked in his ways. All the peoples of the earth would see that they were called by the Lord's name, and they would be afraid of them. The Lord would grant them plenty of goods, in offspring, livestock, and produce. He would open his good treasure, the heavens, to give rain in season. Israel would lend to many nations, but borrow from none. They would be the head and not the tail, above only and not beneath. Section 3. The bitter fruit of rebellion, consequences of covenant rejection. Following the glorious promises of blessings, Moses presented the stark alternative. He detailed the devastating curses that would result from disobedience. But it shall come to pass, if thou wilt not hearken unto the voice of the Lord thy God, he warned. If they failed to observe and do all his commandments and statutes, then all these curses would come upon them and overtake them. This was the solemn and unavoidable consequence of rejecting God's ways. The curses were not arbitrary punishments, they were the natural and judicial outcome of covenant unfaithfulness. Israel stood at a crossroads with two distinct paths before them. One led to life and blessing, the other to death and cursing. The curses were a direct reversal of the promised blessings. Cursed shalt thou be in the city, and cursed shalt thou be in the field, Moses declared. Their basket and their store would be cursed. The fruit of their body, their children would be cursed. The fruit of their land and the increase of their livestock would also suffer. They would experience cursing when they came in and when they went out. The Lord would send on them cursing, confusion, and rebuke. This would affect all that they set their hand to do until they were destroyed and perished quickly because of their wickedness. Their forsaking of God would bring about comprehensive ruin. The curses extended to debilitating diseases and military defeat. The Lord would make pestilence cling to them until it consumed them. He would strike them with consumption, fever, inflammation, and extreme burning. Drought, blight, and mildew would pursue them until they perished. The heavens above them would be brass, and the earth beneath them iron. The Lord would cause them to be defeated before their enemies. They would go out one way against their foes, but flee 7 ways. Their carcasses would be food for birds and beasts, with no one to frighten them away. These graphic descriptions emphasized the horror of God's judgment. It painted a picture of utter desolation and helplessness for a disobedient nation. The curses would culminate in national disgrace and devastating exile. They would become an astonishment, a proverb, and a byword among all nations. The Lord would bring them and the king they set over themselves to a distant nation, a nation unknown to them or their fathers. There they would serve other gods, gods of wood and stone. They would experience oppression and crushing continually. The fruit of their land and all their labors would be consumed by a foreign people. The Lord would scatter them among all peoples, from one end of the earth to the other. Among those nations they would find no ease or rest. Instead, they would have a trembling heart, failing eyes, and anguish of soul. Section 4. Beyond Judgment, the Hope of Renewal, and the Call to Choose Life. After the sobering pronouncements of blessings and curses, Moses gathered Israel. He reminded them of all that the Lord had done before their eyes. He spoke of the great trials in Egypt, the signs and the wonders, yet he noted, "The Lord hath not given you an heart to perceive, and eyes to see, and ears to hear unto this day." Despite witnessing God's mighty acts, true spiritual understanding was lacking for many. Moses then formally renewed the covenant with this generation. This covenant included not only those present but also future generations. It was a solemn pact binding them to the Lord their God, to walk in his ways and to keep his commandments faithfully. This renewal emphasized the ongoing nature of their relationship with God. Moses warned sternly against the presence of any hidden idolatry. He cautioned against anyone whose heart might turn away from the Lord, anyone who might secretly desire to worship the gods of other nations. Such a person would be like a root bearing poison and bitterness. If an individual heard the words of the curse and blessed himself in his heart, saying, "I shall have peace, even though I follow the dictates of my heart," the Lord would not spare him. His anger and jealousy would burn against that man. All the curses written in the book would lie on him. The Lord would blot out his name from under heaven. This underscored God's intolerance for hypocrisy and secret sin within the covenant community. Despite the dire warnings of judgment and exile for disobedience, Deuteronomy does not end on a note of utter despair. Moses prophesied a future restoration for Israel even after dispersion. "And it shall come to pass, when all these things are come upon thee," he stated, the blessing and the curse which he had set before them, if they called them to mind among all the nations where God had driven them, and if they returned to the Lord their God and obeyed his voice with all their heart and with all their soul, according to all he commanded, then the Lord their God would turn their captivity and have compassion upon them. He would regather them from all the nations where he had scattered them. This promise of restoration culminated in an impassioned plea. Moses declared, "See, I have set before thee this day life and good and death and evil." He commanded them to love the Lord their God, to walk in his ways, and to keep his commandments, statutes, and judgments, so that they might live and multiply, and be blessed in the land. But if their heart turned away, and they would not hear, if they were drawn away to worship other gods and serve them, he announced that they would surely perish. "I call heaven and earth to record this day against you," Moses solemnly affirmed, "that I have set before you life and death, blessing and cursing. Therefore choose life, that both thou and thy seed may live." Section 1. The mantle passed, the word entrusted. Moses knew his time on earth was drawing to a close. He gathered all Israel for his final words of direct leadership. He told them, "I am 120 years old this day." He could no longer go out and come in as their leader. His physical strength, though remarkably preserved, was now to give way to a new phase. Furthermore, the Lord had explicitly told him, "Thou shalt not go over this Jordan." This divine decree, a consequence of his earlier failure at Meribah, was now at hand. Moses accepted God's decision with grace, focusing instead on Israel's future. His concern was for the people he had shepherded for 4 decades through the wilderness. Despite his own inability to enter Canaan, Moses reassured the people. "The Lord thy God, he will go over before thee," he declared. God himself would destroy the nations inhabiting the land. Israel would take possession of their territories. Then, Moses publicly designated his successor. "Joshua, he shall go over before thee, as the Lord hath said." This was a critical moment of transition. Moses then spoke directly to Joshua in the sight of all Israel. "Be strong and of a good courage," he exhorted. For Joshua was chosen to bring the people into the land sworn to their fathers. Moses repeated this encouragement to all the people, urging them not to fear or be dismayed, for the Lord would be with them. A crucial act performed by Moses was the preservation of God's law. He wrote down this law referring to the core teachings of Deuteronomy. He then delivered it to the priests, the sons of Levi. These men were responsible for carrying the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord. He also entrusted it to all the elders of Israel. Moses commanded them concerning its public use. At the end of every 7 years, in the solemnity of the year of release, in the Feast of Tabernacles, he instructed, when all Israel came to appear before the Lord their God in the chosen place, they were to read this law before all Israel in their hearing. This was a vital provision for the ongoing spiritual health of the nation. The purpose of this septennial reading was multi-generational. "Gather the people together, men and women and children," Moses ordered. Even the stranger within their gates was to be included. The aim was that they may hear and that they may learn. They were to fear the Lord their God and to observe to do all the words of this law. Furthermore, their children, who had not known these initial events, would hear. They, too, would learn to fear the Lord their God. This was to continue as long as they lived in the land they were crossing the Jordan to possess. God also revealed to Moses his foreknowledge of Israel's future apostasy after Moses' death, making this written law a future witness. The Lord summoned Moses and Joshua to the tabernacle of meeting to commission Joshua. The Lord appeared in a pillar of cloud over the door of the tabernacle. God spoke to Moses, saying, "Behold, thy days approach that thou must die." He reiterated Israel's future unfaithfulness, knowing they would forsake him and break the covenant. God instructed Moses to write a song as a witness against Israel. Moses was to teach it to the children of Israel. The song would testify against them when they turned to other gods. Moses wrote the song that very day and taught it to the children of Israel. He completed writing the words of the law in a book. Moses commanded the Levites to place the book beside the Ark of the Covenant. It was to remain as a witness against them. Moses knew their rebellion and stiff neck. He gathered all the elders and officers and spoke the words of the Song of Moses. The song extols God's faithfulness and justice, recounting his care for Israel. It portrays Israel's apostasy and God's righteous judgment, yet it concludes with a promise of God's ultimate compassion. He would avenge his servants and make atonement for his land and people. The song stands as a poetic masterpiece calling God the Rock. It vividly portrays Israel's turning to idols and forsaking God. The song ends with a promise of God's sovereign grace. Before his death, Moses bestowed a final blessing upon the tribes of Israel. It was a prophetic utterance, speaking of the future character and destiny of each tribe. Moses began by extolling the Lord who came from Sinai. He set a majestic tone, emphasizing God's glory and his gift of the law. Moses blessed the individual tribes, starting with Reuben, praying for its preservation. For Judah, he acknowledged its future leadership role and prayed for strength. The blessing for Levi praised their faithfulness and priestly duties. For Benjamin he prophesied divine protection and dwelling near God. The blessings for Joseph's tribe spoke of immense fertility and abundance. Zebulun and Issachar were blessed for their prosperity and sacrifices. Gad was blessed for strength and righteous execution of God's justice. Dan was likened to a lion's whelp. Naphtali was to be satisfied with favor and full of the Lord's blessing. Asher was to be blessed with children and prosperity. The collective blessing concluded with powerful praise for Israel. Moses declared, "There is none like unto the God of Jeshurun." He proclaimed, "The eternal God is thy refuge, and underneath are the everlasting arms." God would thrust out the enemy, and Israel would dwell in safety. Moses finished with a triumphant affirmation, "Happy art thou, O Israel, who is like unto thee, O people saved by the Lord." The blessings reflected God's intricate plan for his chosen people. Following these final blessings, Moses obeyed the Lord's command. He went up from the plains of Moab unto the mountain of Nebo. From the top of Pisgah, the Lord showed him the promised land. Moses saw the full extent of the land God had promised to his people. The Lord affirmed the promise, saying, "This is the land which I swear unto Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob." God told Moses, "I have caused thee to see it with thine eyes, but thou shalt not go over thither." Moses accepted this outcome, demonstrating his submission to God's will. So Moses, the servant of the Lord, died in the land of Moab. The Lord himself buried Moses in a valley in the land of Moab. The exact location remained unknown to prevent his tomb from becoming an object of worship. Moses was 120 years old when he died, retaining his vitality to the end. The children of Israel mourned for Moses in the plains of Moab for 30 days. Joshua the son of Nun was filled with the spirit of wisdom, for Moses had laid his hands upon him. The children of Israel hearkened unto Joshua and did as the Lord commanded Moses. The book concludes with an unparalleled eulogy, "And there arose not a prophet since in Israel like unto Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face." His unique relationship with God set him apart as God's preeminent prophet. The signs, wonders, and mighty power displayed through him in Egypt and the wilderness were unmatched. Moses' life's work was complete, and he was gathered to his people. His legacy as a faithful servant of the Lord endures. The children of Israel continued under Joshua's leadership, as commanded by Moses. The Book of Deuteronomy stands as a monumental conclusion to the Pentateuch. It powerfully reiterates God's covenant with Israel. Moses passionately called the people to obedience from a heart wholly devoted to God. The core message was clear: choose God, choose life. This summons to covenant faithfulness echoes through its chapters. A central theme is remembrance of God's mighty acts. Israel was urged to remember his deliverance from slavery in Egypt. They were to recall his faithful provision in the wilderness. Forgetting God's goodness was presented as a path to ruin. Remembering was the pathway to continued blessing and fellowship. Moses set before Israel two distinct paths, life and good, or death and evil. The blessings for covenant loyalty were rich and comprehensive. The curses for covenant rejection were severe and devastating. This choice required a daily commitment to love and serve the Lord. Israel's future depended on this solemn decision. Deuteronomy's call is for a people set apart for God. The laws and statutes were given for their good, guiding them to honor God. The demand for wholehearted devotion was an invitation to experience God's presence. The book serves as a guide to living as God's holy people, a community defined by love for God and obedience to his commands. The teachings of Deuteronomy resonate powerfully with believers today. The call to love the Lord God with all one's heart, soul, and might remains. This central imperative transcends cultural and historical boundaries. Christians find deep meaning in its pages, guided by principles of faithfulness and obedience. Deuteronomy challenges every generation to examine their commitment to God. The Lord Jesus Christ affirmed the core message of Deuteronomy. He identified the command to love God completely as the greatest commandment. For Christians, the law is fulfilled in Christ, yet its principles continue to instruct. Deuteronomy serves as a constant reminder of wholehearted devotion. God seeks our entire being, dedicated to His service and glory. This call to consecration requires daily choices to prioritize God above all else. We must guard against the idols of our own age. This pursuit of undivided loyalty is a lifelong aspiration. It is a journey empowered by His grace and Spirit. Deuteronomy's message urges us to covenant faithfulness. May we strive to love the Lord our God more deeply. May we seek to obey His commands more fully. And may we remember His incredible faithfulness to us through Jesus Christ. This ancient book still speaks with clarity and power today. It invites us into a relationship of loving, wholehearted devotion. Thank you for joining us. Like, share, and subscribe for more Bible insights, faith-filled encouragement, and spiritual growth. God bless you, my friend.